चलो उसकी छन्नीच कर देते, वो भाइयों का काम था।
Akku Yadav, a local criminal, was stabbed and stoned to death today.
उसने कड़कड़ चाकू खोला, बोला हाँ भाई अक्कू यादव नाम है मेरा, बदमाश हूँ मैं।
किसी ने कान काटा उसका, किसी ने कुछ।
महिलाओं को उसको कोर्ट में आके मारना पड़ा।
What would you do to avenge a lost child? Would you call authorities over and over again, hoping they will pursue and arrest the killer? And how long would you wait until you took matters into your own hands? These are the stories of grieving, raging mothers who did not feel the law was on their side, and when they got tired of waiting for an arrest, they acted out in the most brutal way. Let's learn about some of the toughest moms who avenged their children's murders.
Why did the women of Nagpur feel the need to kill?
On June 8, 1999, Asha Bhatt met a grisly fate at the hands of a local criminal she had stood up to. She had confronted Akku Yadav for extorting money from locals. Asha's sister, Raisha, remembers.
Asha helped and worked for the poor and the disadvantaged. She stood up for everyone who was tortured and beaten by Akku. So, he started seeing her as a thorn in his side that he needed to get rid of. We used to tell her not to engage with him, but she used to say, if my death is destined in his hands, I'll die.
Sadly, Asha would end up yet another number on the long list of women Akku Yadav SA'd and killed. After subjecting her to a fate worse than death, he took her life with his own hands. Then, he added insult to injury.
He slit her throat, cut off her ears, her breasts, and stole her jewelry. And he didn't stop there. A few weeks later, he returned with his gang and plundered everything in the house and turned it into their hangout.
What's worse, Yadav took Asha's life in front of her 14-year-old daughter. Imagine what seeing this does to a child. Because of this criminal, everyone who lived in the Kasturba Nagar lived in constant fear.
We lived in fear every waking moment. Children stopped going to school. Like many women, I too stopped going out of the house altogether. No marriage proposals for women from Kasturba Nagar ever got accepted. There were no relatives coming from or going to anyone's house or any celebrations taking place, all because of Akku.
What's worse, authorities seemed to do nothing about him. Had he bribed them to protect him? Or were they that scared of him? Sadly, with SA, such a taboo topic in India, few women reported the crimes. And when they did, the authorities arrested Akku, kept him for a few hours, then even told him who had filed the report. Yadav would find his victim and once again terrorize her, pillaging her home or subjecting her to unspeakable once more. So you can imagine fewer and fewer women reported him. Authorities were protecting the criminal, not them. In 2004, there was another incident that rocked Nagpur. Yadav and his gang barged into the house of a student named Usha. She'd helped another woman file an SA case against Yadav a few days prior, so this was his revenge. Instead, Usha refused to let them in. She dragged a cooking gas cylinder to the door, opened the valve, and pulled out a match. She said she would happily set herself on fire and blow everyone up, rather than let them do to her what they'd done to her friend. Yadav and his gang retreated that night, but the incident gave other women ideas, including Anjanabai Borkar, the mother of Asha Bhatt. It had been a decade of unspeakable crimes at the hands of this monster, and authorities were doing nothing about it. In fact, they were protecting Yadav and his horrible gang. More and more women wanted to do something about it. So over the summer of 2004, Anjanabai organized some 200 women to storm his house and remove him from this world.
Everyone had just one thing on their mind, to see the end of Akku Yadav. There was no fear anymore, only frustration and determination.
Yadav got word of this, so he went to the nearest station, seeking protection. But this real-life monster was not going to make it much longer. On August 13th, hundreds of women raided the station and reduced him to ashes.
किसी ने कान काटा उसका, किसी ने कुछ.
Yep, this was years of fear, helplessness, and rage combined. It was the last drop. The women were armed with knives, stones, and chili powder. Within a few minutes, he was ripped to shreds. His grisly death was not just revenge, but also a message to the justice system.
Akku Yadav, a local criminal, was stabbed and stoned to death today.
उसने कड़कड़ चाकू खोला, बोला हाँ भाई अक्कू यादव नाम है मेरा, बदमाश हूँ मैं।
जनता नहीं करती तो शायद कानून कुछ नहीं कर पाता।
आज अगर नहीं निकले तो तुम लोग जिंदगी में कभी नहीं निकल पाओगे।
The circumstances of Yadav's death have been interpreted as a rising up against not just the criminal, but also a judicial system that repeatedly fails the underprivileged. 4 women were initially arrested, including one who was pregnant. Learning about this, several of the women surrounded the Sadar police station to protest the arrest. Within the hour, there were 400 women, 100 men, and several children protesting. the police eventually gave in to the pressure. The detective sat down with some of the older women and discussed a deal.
They made us an offer. Give us any 5 old women.
One of the 5 old women to surrender was Resha and Asha's mother, Anjanabai Borkar. She was one of the main organizers, and she was happy to do some jail time if it meant so many other women would be able to continue their lives. She was held in prison for 5 days, after which she was released on bail. When she got out, she was welcomed like a hero. 10 years later, in 2014, the case against the women, including Borkar, was dismissed on account of inconclusive evidence. Resha says this was the only way the law could pay them back after all their unspeakable suffering at the hands of a demon and a corrupt police force. On January 26, 2000, 21-year-old Kiko Smith was hanging out with a friend at his place in Anacostia, Washington. Kiko worked on construction sites and was already a father of 2. But that night, his chance at joy was cut short in a gruesome way. Someone called Kiko outside to join them in their car. When he came out of the house, expecting a friend, he was surprised to see a middle-aged woman instead. She asked if his name was Kiko. He said yeah. She looked him dead in the eyes, then pulled out a firearm from her purse. Desperate, Kiko ran for his life, but it was dark, freezing, and snowy, so he did not make it far. 49-year-old Barbara Graham shot Kiko Smith 3 times. 1 bullet made it into his back, paralyzing him from the waist down. Kiko lay bleeding in the snow for minutes until his terrified friend reached him and phoned authorities, requesting an ambulance.
That's Mrs. Barbara. While I was running, I turned and I saw her shooting at me. The bullets were right above my head, and the next thing I know, I was shot in the back and I fell.
But Barbara was not alone that night. She was with her daughter's boyfriend, 30-year-old Erskine Moorer. Barbara and her oldest daughter wanted revenge for LePierre Clement, Barbara's 19-year-old son. You see, just 2 days before this, Barbara had buried LePierre. He had been a victim of gun violence. Like so many teens and young adults in the US, it was an unspeakable tragedy for Barbara. She kept saying, "They took my baby. I have nothing left." She fell into a pit of despair, where all she could think about was who took his life, why, and how she could exercise the worst kind of revenge on him. So Barbara remembered something her son had told her. A man named Kiko Smith, who he allegedly had a serious beef with. Barbara made up her mind that Kiko was responsible for LePierre's death, and she rallied up her immediate family to help remove him from this earth. Except Kiko was the wrong guy. As the affidavit for Barbara's arrest would state, Kiko was not even remotely connected to LePierre's slaying. Barbara Graham and Erskine Moorer were soon arrested on suspicion of murder. Kiko was able to identify both as the culprits. In the courtroom, Barbara kept crying and insisting she never shot Kiko.
I want to know about my child. I want my baby. You know I didn't kill that boy. They set me up.
Her daughters and sister were there, all crying together and insisting Barbara was too kind of a person to do something like this. Except Kiko saw her do it, and someone else testified about it. Jermaine Drummond, another accomplice who was supposed to drive Barbara away from the crime scene. Now, Jermaine had told Barbara that night to abort the attack. He was pretty sure Kiko Smith was innocent. He had not taken LePierre's life, but Barbara had made up her mind and she thought, if I don't do this today, I never will. Kiko himself testified in court. As it turns out, he and LePierre had had a beef in the past. In 1996, 4 years prior to LePierre's death, they were angry, rebellious teens who hung out on the streets and threatened each other easily. This was just their world back then. But soon, the enemies became friends, and there were no other conflicts after this. However, LePierre was in an ongoing conflict with a different group of boys in the southeast neighborhood. That's where he lost his life on January 17th. He went there, and he was ambushed by the group and unalived by another young man. Barbara herself had told her son not to go around the southeast again. She knew there was trouble awaiting LePierre, so if she knew about this, why did she think only Kiko could have done it? Why didn't she wait to research the situation better? And why on earth did she take matters into her own hands? Judge Michael L. Rankin said,
"Any way you weigh the case, it's simply tragedy upon tragedy."
Assistant U.S. Attorney Luttrell M.C. Osborne said,
"What is this case all about? Rage, revenge, and retribution."
Barbara's attorney, Billy Pons, said something else. Barbara did wait for authorities to solve her son's death first, but nothing was done. Even as she called them several times a day, they refused to give her information or keep her updated. It seemed like they weren't doing anything. Just another teen shot by another teen in the never-ending gang wars. So, according to Barbara's attorney, it was almost like she had no choice but to avenge her son. as no one else would. However, in this day and age, this is not how we get closure or bring justice. Kiko painted a tragic picture during Barbara's trial. He spoke from a wheelchair, with the third bullet still lodged in his spine.
Now, I feel invisible. My children treat me differently now. I am dependent on other people. I have a lot of anger. When my brother was murdered in 1999, we did not go out and retaliate on the person we thought killed him. Of course we hurt and we were angry, but we put the situation in the Lord's hands.
Indeed, Kiko had also lost a brother to the same type of violence, but no one in his family sought vengeance, and they let the justice system take care of the killer. In a really ironic twist, Barbara had helped organize the Million Mom March against gun violence in May 2000. This was 4 months after she had tried to take Kiko's life. Was this her showing regret, or her trying to clear her image in an attempt to convince the judge she was innocent? Whichever the case, by July of that year, she would be incarcerated and she would never return home. At a June 2001 hearing, Barbara's attorney told the judge that because she denied shooting Kiko, it was not possible to express remorse. He asked that her sentence show that it's time to try to heal and not to exact revenge. When Barbara returned to the courtroom after interrupting with a nervous breakdown, she apologized for her breakdown and implored the judge to let her go home. She had been locked up for a year.
I want to stay with my children. My children need me.
Although her children were all adults at this point, one of her daughters had tried taking her own life. Both her children and grandchildren have needed counseling, Barbara said. But again, she refused to take responsibility, even with several witnesses now testifying to what she did. The judge told her he could not free her. A jury found her guilty of assault, with intent to kill while armed, aggravated assault, mayhem, and a long list of related offenses. Both Barbara and Erskine Moore were sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. It's unclear if they have been released yet. While her family supported her in claiming she was innocent, others supported her another way. From local politicians to people following the case online, many pointed out that the city was famous for unsolved gun crimes. So, although it is extremely rare for a mother to take matters into her own hands using a firearm in the US, Barbara's case made sense to some. She was a desperate mother, tired of authorities not doing anything to curb gun violence and protect kids. For Miriam Rodriguez Martinez, everything changed on January 23, 2014. That day, her 20-year-old daughter Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez was driving through San Fernando when 2 trucks pulled up beside her. Armed men forced their way into her car and then drove off with her. Like any mom, Miriam was devastated and infuriated. She was going to do absolutely anything to get Karen back, but as she spoke to authorities, she realized there was a very slim chance Karen would be rescued by officers of the law. You see, cartel kidnappings happen so often in some parts of Mexico that the law doesn't even bother to look into the cases. Plus, many officers are in the cartel's pockets, protecting their crimes instead of working hard to arrest them. So, Miriam took matters into her own hands. First, she learned who had taken Karen, the Los Zetas cartel. This was bad news. The Los Zetas cartel remains one of the most brutal cartels to ever walk the earth. Their infamous videos caused waves of terror on the internet. And for the Zetas, abduction ransoms were one of their main income sources. But Miriam was not put off by this. She wanted her daughter back, and nothing would change her mind. Even when the rest of her family worried she would lose her life, she said, "So what?" Justice was more important to her. Of course, Karen's snatching was also meant for ransom. So before long, the Zetas contacted Miriam with several demands and threats. Miriam and her family took out a loan to pay Karen's ransom and left a bag of money at a drop-off point. Still, Karen did not come home. With no other options, Miriam Rodriguez asked to meet with a cartel member. To her surprise, one sicario agreed. Though he told her that he didn't know where Karen was, he offered to help find her for $2,000 American dollars. Miriam paid the fee, but this also led to nothing. The sicario was just happy to take her money. Miriam thought this might happen. Cartels are not made of honest people, but in the process, she sort of befriended the man, just enough to learn his name, Sama. With this information in hand, Miriam had found her first clue. She told her surviving daughter that she believed that Karen was dead, but that she would not rest until she'd hunted down her snatchers. Miriam Rodriguez took it step by step, something local authorities were clearly not willing to do. After she found Sama on Facebook, she identified one of his friends by her ice cream store uniform and spent hours waiting outside the shop until he appeared. Then, she followed him. Miriam found out where Sama lived, but she still needed more information. To sneak around his neighborhood undetected, she dyed her hair red, wore an old uniform, and spoke to his neighbors under the guise of conducting a poll. And after being ignored by the authorities for months, Miriam eventually found an ally within the federal force who was willing to help her. Though Sama escaped arrest the first time, the authorities were able to eventually arrest him. Sama gave the police names of other cartel members, who shed even more light on Karen's abduction. One even agreed to take the officers to the ranch where Karen had been unalived. At the ranch, Miriam found Karen's scarf, a cushion from her truck, and one of her femur bones. Imagine seeing this as a mother. Now Miriam knew for sure that her daughter was gone, but she had no time to grieve. She had several more men to catch. Miriam Rodriguez would hunt down 10 cartel members, all of whom had played a role in her daughter's death. Many had left the cartel, but Miriam knew they were just protecting themselves. After one of the men was arrested inside a chapel, some witnesses told the media they thought Miriam had no compassion. What an outrageous statement, right? She responded to the media,
Where was his compassion when they killed my daughter?
Miriam Rodriguez thus became known as the woman who did not fear death. She even spoke publicly about it. Sadly, Miriam would indeed lose her life at the hands of Los Zetas. In March 2017, 29 inmates dug a tunnel and escaped from a prison in Ciudad Victoria, where Karen's abductors had been imprisoned. Miriam knew her life was in danger, so she asked for the authorities' protection. They agreed to send patrols to her area, but on May 10th of that year, Miriam was found by Los Zetas when an SUV driven by the escaped inmates pulled up in front of her house. In a way, Miriam was lucky to lose her life in a matter of seconds. She was hit by a dozen bullets and left sprawled in their driveway, her hand in her purse, where she kept her pistol. In many other cases, Los Zetas would subject their victims to days of unspeakable things. Miriam had an easy way out. Nonetheless, her death enraged people across the state. Authorities ended up arresting 2 of Miriam's killers, and a third died in an unrelated cartel battle soon after. Miriam's son took over her collective, the San Fernando Collective for the Disappeared. The organization sadly crumbled within a year or two, but Miriam's story inspired so many more parents. Heartbreakingly, since the war on drugs started in 2006, the snatching numbers have only risen, and many grieving parents find themselves in the same position as Miriam. They have to take over the investigation and lead authorities to Sicarios' front doors if they want to get justice for their lost ones. Other parents, however, go straight for the pistol. This terrifying story begins with a little girl called Asha Bhatt. Asha Bhatt was born in Lübeck, Germany, on November 14, 1972, to Marianne Bachmeier, who was 23 at the time. Anna's father chose not to be involved in the pregnancy or Anna's upbringing, so Marianne was raising Anna as a single parent. Marianne worked as a waitress at a local bar, while Anna attended elementary school. Marianne would often work late hours and close the bar, so Anna would walk from school to her mother's bar and hang out there till Marianne was done. And some mornings, Marianne would be too tired to walk Anna to school. Some people in the community didn't agree with this, but what was a single mother to do? On the morning of May 5, 1980, Anna had an argument with her mother. She left home upset and decided she would walk over to a friend's house instead of going to school that day. But her friend wasn't home. It's likely she'd gone to school. So Anna decided to walk to school as well. But she never made it to the school gates. Just a few houses away from her own home, she was stopped by a 35-year-old man called Klaus Grabowski. He was the local butcher and a familiar face. When he saw Anna, he asked her if she wanted to come in and play with his cats. Poor Anna thought nothing of it. Grabowski essayed Anna for several hours before unaliving her with a pair of his fiance's tights. Imagine learning who you've just got engaged to this way. Grabowski then placed Anna's body in a box and buried her on the banks of the local canal in a shallow grave. When his fiancée returned home from work later that afternoon and learned what he had done, she immediately contacted authorities. Investigators discovered Anna's remains and arrested Grabowski that day. The same day, detectives also found out that Grabowski had received a probation sentence in 1973, and in 1975, he has aided 2 9-year-olds. Wait, how was he not punished for this? Reportedly, he was. Grabowski accepted the option of chemical castration instead of a prison sentence in 1976. It's shocking that it was an option in the first place. And then, there was another shocking layer to the story. It turns out, Grabowski lied to a doctor and obtained hormone therapy to reverse the effects of his punishment. On March 3, 1981, his trial for taking Asha Bachmeier's life began. Grabowski's testimony was sickening. He said that 7-year-old Anna had attempted to seduce him and that he had unalived her because she had threatened to tell her mother of the attack unless he gave her money. Marianne sat in the courtroom, fuming. How could he say these things about her daughter? How could he not show 1 ounce of remorse, or at least reason? He saw himself as a victim in this stomach-turning story. On March 6th, 3 days into the trial, Marianne arrived early, as always, sporting her elegant trench coat. Except this time, she carried a .22 caliber Beretta in her pocket. She waited for Grabowski to enter the courtroom and sit down before the room was filled with people. As soon as he sat, she fired 7 rounds at him. Grabowski's lifeless body was carried out of the room that day, to no one's regret. In Marianne's eyes, that was the only possible justice for him. His lack of remorse and attempt to shift the blame onto Anna meant he would never really sit and think about what he'd done, no matter the amount of years behind bars he would get. But of course, Marianne knew she would be arrested for this. After all, she'd done it in front of several officers and bailiffs. She was sentenced to 6 years for manslaughter, but she served only 3. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Marianne contacted a television network to make a documentary about her life and Anna's story. She died in 1996 and was buried next to Anna. Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on these cases? And do you know other similar stories? Let me know in a comment, and before you leave, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time.